On December 12, 1982, a 20-year-old security guard named Chris Potamitis walked into the Sentry Armored Car Depot in the Bronx. He was scheduled to work the night shift alone. By morning, $11 million in cash would be gone. At 20 years old, he was the youngest security guard the company had ever hired. He had been working there for only 8 months. Chris came from a Greek-American family in Queens. His parents had immigrated from Greece and worked hard to build a life in America. They owned a small restaurant and expected their son to follow a similar path. But Chris had different ideas. He wanted fast money and an easier life. The Sentry Depot was a fortress-like building where armored trucks brought cash from banks, stores, and businesses across New York City. Millions of dollars passed through the facility every day. On weekends, when the banks were closed, the money just sat there in canvas bags, waiting for Monday morning. That night, Chris was the only person in the building. It was standard procedure. One guard worked the overnight shift while the building held anywhere from $8 to $12 million in cash. The money was stored in a large vault area, but it wasn't in a traditional bank vault. The cash sat in large canvas bags on shelves and tables throughout the storage room. Chris had been planning this robbery for months. He didn't plan it alone. 3 other Greek-American men were involved: Eddie Argitakos, Sal Natural, and Potamitis' childhood friend, whose name was never fully disclosed in court records. All 4 men were in their early 20s and had grown up in Queens. The plan was simple. Chris would let his 3 partners into the building through a side entrance. They would load the money into bags and leave. Chris would then claim that masked gunmen had tied him up and robbed the place. It seemed foolproof. Around 11:30 p.m., Chris walked to the side door of the building. His hands were shaking as he turned the locks. He had been thinking about this moment for weeks. But now that it was happening, the reality hit him. He opened the door and saw Eddie, Sal, and his childhood friend standing in the darkness. The 3 men entered the building quietly. Chris led them through the hallways to the storage area where the money was kept. When they opened the door, all 4 men stopped and stared. Canvas bags filled with cash covered every surface. There were bags of 20s, 50s, and hundreds. Some bags contained coins. The room looked like something out of a movie. They had brought several large duffel bags and started filling them with cash. They worked quickly but quietly. The building was empty, but they were paranoid about making noise. Each bag of money they grabbed was heavy. A bag full of $20 bills weighed about 40 pounds. Chris stood in the doorway, watching his friends work. Part of him couldn't believe what he was doing. He had a steady job and came from a good family. But the money was right there, and it seemed so easy. They had been working for about 20 minutes. The 3 men carried the duffel bags back through the building toward the side door. Chris helped them load everything into Eddie's van, which was parked in the alley behind the building. Chris told them he would wait about an hour, then call the police and say he was tied up in the bathroom. His friends drove away into the night. Chris went back inside the building and looked at the storage room. It was obvious that someone had taken money, but there was still cash everywhere. He had no idea how much they had actually stolen. Chris went to the bathroom and waited. He tried to mess up his hair and clothes to make it look like he had been attacked. His heart was pounding. At 12:45 a.m., he called 911. "This is Chris Potamitis at Sentry Armored Car Company," he said, trying to sound panicked. "I've been robbed. 3 men with guns tied me up and took money from the vault. Police arrived within minutes. Detective Frank McNally was one of the first officers on scene. He found Chris sitting in the office area, looking shaken up. Chris told the detective that 3 masked men had broken into the building around midnight, tied him up in the bathroom, and stolen bags of money. "How did they get in?" Detective McNally asked. "I don't know," Chris replied. "They must have had keys or something." McNally walked through the building with Chris. There were no signs of forced entry. All the doors and windows were intact. The side door that Chris had used to let his friends in showed no damage. "This is strange," McNally told his partner. "No broken glass, no damaged locks. How did they get in?" The detective also noticed that Chris didn't have any rope marks on his wrists or ankles. For someone who claimed to have been tied up for over an hour, he looked remarkably uninjured. Sentry officials arrived at the scene around 2 a.m. They began counting the money to determine how much was missing. It took them several hours to get an accurate count. When they finished, they discovered that $11 million was gone. At the time, it was the largest cash robbery in United States history. News of the heist spread quickly. By Monday morning, reporters from every major newspaper and television station in New York were covering the story. The FBI took over the investigation from local police. Special Agent Tom Sweeney was assigned to lead the federal investigation. He had worked dozens of armored car robberies during his career, and something about this case bothered him from the beginning. Inside jobs usually have certain characteristics, Sweeney explained to his team. This one has all of them. The FBI began investigating Chris's background. They discovered that he had been having financial problems before the robbery. He owed money to several people and had been asking friends and family for loans. They also learned that he had been asking unusual questions about the security procedures at Sentry. Chris's co-workers told investigators that he had been asking about the weekend schedules and how much money was typically stored in the building on different nights. One co-worker remembered Chris asking, "What would happen if someone robbed this place?" Meanwhile, Chris tried to act normal. He went back to work at Sentry a few days after the robbery. His supervisors and co-workers treated him like a hero who had survived a traumatic experience. The company even gave him a small raise and extra time off. But Chris was having trouble sleeping. Every time he heard a car door slam or saw police lights, he thought they were coming for him. The money was hidden in various locations around Queens, but he was afraid to touch it. Eddie, Sal, and the third accomplice were also nervous. They had divided the money 4 ways, giving each person about $2.75 million, but they couldn't spend it freely without drawing attention. Eddie started making small purchases first. He bought new clothes and a better car. He told people he had gotten lucky gambling in Atlantic City. Sal began renovating his mother's house, claiming he had saved money from his construction job. Chris was more careful. He paid off some small debts but didn't make any major purchases. His friends thought he was being too paranoid, but Chris knew the FBI was watching him. 3 weeks after the robbery, Agent Sweeney got his first real break in the case. A confidential informant told the FBI that Eddie Argatakos had been flashing large amounts of cash around Queens. The informant said Eddie claimed to have hit it big, but wouldn't say how. The FBI began surveillance on Eddie. They watched his house, followed his car, and monitored his spending. Within a week, they observed him making several large cash purchases that didn't match his legitimate income. On January 15, 1983, exactly 1 month after the robbery, The FBI arrested Eddie at his apartment in Queens. During the search, they found $47,000 in cash hidden in his bedroom wall. Eddie was taken to FBI headquarters in Manhattan for questioning. For the first 4 hours, he denied any involvement in the Sentry robbery. He claimed the money came from gambling and side jobs. But as the interrogation continued, Eddie began to crack. Agent Sweeney showed him evidence of his spending patterns and explained that the FBI had been watching him for weeks. "We know you were involved," Sweeney said. "The question is whether you want to cooperate or go down with everyone else." Around midnight, Eddie broke down and confessed everything. He told the FBI about the planning meetings, how Chris had let them into the building, and where some of the money was hidden. He also gave up the names of his 3 accomplices. The next morning, FBI agents arrested Chris at his apartment in Queens. His parents were devastated. They couldn't understand how their son had gotten involved in such a serious crime. Chris was taken to the same interrogation room where Eddie had confessed. Agent Sweeney laid out everything they knew about the case. "Eddie already told us everything," Sweeney said. "He explained how you let them in, how you planned it together, and where the money is. You can cooperate with us, or you can go to trial and face the maximum sentence." Chris sat quietly for several minutes. He knew his life was over either way, but he decided to cooperate. He confirmed Eddie's story and provided additional details about the planning and execution of the robbery. Sal and the 4th accomplice were arrested later that day. All 4 men were charged with federal crimes, including bank robbery, conspiracy, and theft of interstate commerce. The arrests made front-page news in New York. The media portrayed Chris as the mastermind who had betrayed his employer's trust. His family received threatening phone calls and had to change their phone number. During the investigation, the FBI recovered about $3.2 million of the stolen money. The rest was never found. Some of it had been spent, but investigators believed that several $1 million was still hidden somewhere in the New York area. Chris's lawyer advised him to plead guilty and cooperate fully with the government. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed to recommend a reduced sentence. On June 14, 1983, Chris appeared in federal court in Manhattan for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators. Chris's parents sat in the front row, both crying. Judge William Connor asked Chris if he wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Chris stood up and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong. I let down my family, my employer, and myself. I made a terrible mistake, and I'm ready to pay for it." Judge Connor sentenced Chris to 12 years in federal prison. Eddie received 10 years. Sal got 8 years. The 4th accomplice, who had cooperated extensively with the investigation, received 6 years. Chris was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. It was a medium-security prison that housed about 1,200 inmates. Chris was 21 years old when he entered prison. Prison was harder than Chris had expected. He was young and inexperienced, and many of the other inmates saw him as an easy target. He got into several fights during his first year and spent time in solitary confinement. But Chris gradually adapted to prison life. He worked in the prison library and took college courses through a correspondence program. He read constantly and began writing about his experiences. "I had a lot of time to think about what I had done," Chris later said. "I realized that I had thrown away everything for money that I couldn't even spend." Chris's parents visited him every month. They had lost their restaurant due to the legal expenses and shame from the case, but they never stopped supporting their son. In 1987, after serving 4 years, Chris was transferred to a minimum security prison camp in Pennsylvania. The conditions were much better, and he was able to work outside the facility during the day. Chris was released from prison in December 1991, after serving 9 years of his 12-year sentence. He was 30 years old and had no money, no job prospects, and a federal conviction on his record. He moved back in with his parents in Queens, took a job at a construction company. The work was hard and the pay was low, but Chris was grateful to be free. He kept a low profile and tried to rebuild his life. For several years, Chris worked various jobs and stayed out of trouble. He met a woman named Maria and they got married in 1995. They had 2 children together and bought a small house on Long Island. Chris rarely talked about the robbery or his time in prison. He told his children that he had made mistakes when he was young and had learned from them. In the early 2000s, Chris started his own construction company. The business grew slowly but steadily. He was honest with his employees and customers about his past, and most people respected his efforts to make a legitimate life. Around 2010, Chris began thinking about telling his story in a different way. He had read several books and seen movies about famous robberies, and he felt that most of them glorified the criminals or got the facts wrong. "I wanted to show that crime doesn't pay," Chris explained. "I wanted young people to see what really happens when you make stupid choices." Chris contacted a literary agent and began working on a book about his experiences. The agent introduced him to several Hollywood producers who were interested in turning his story into a movie. In 2012, Chris signed a deal to co-produce a film based on his life and the Sentry robbery. The movie would be called Empire State, named after the nickname that newspapers had given to the heist. Today, Chris lives quietly on Long Island with his family. His construction company is successful, and he has never been arrested again. He occasionally speaks to young people about the consequences of crime. The FBI still considers the Empire State robbery one of the most significant armored car heists in American history. Of the $11 million stolen, only about $3.2 million was ever recovered. The remaining money was never found.